Okay, so this session is about the alder tree. And again, as with most of these sessions, I'm not really going to talk about the botanical lore of the alder tree. I am more interested in the mythology and history and other esoteric ideas about it. But this moment in time is very special. We've just transitioned from the rowan tree into the alder tree. That's today, and that's technically the midpoint between winter solstice and spring equinox, cross-quarter fire festival moment in bulk. So I nicknamed the alder tree as the second herald of Imbolc. So Rowan is the first herald of Imbolc. Now, what's interesting to me is that the Ogham as a tree law system is Irish, but a lot of the law that I'm aware of and the patterns that I'm finding are Welsh. So they're both Celtic systems of or ancestral law, but they're different as well. But I am very interested in their common ground, and I've touched on this before, that the common ground seems to be a magical game, which is often translated as chess, but it's not chess. And I'll just quickly say what it is again, and then we'll look at start making sense of the alder tree. So in Wales, this game of chess is called gwyddbwyll, and in Ireland it's called fidgil, and they both mean the same thing. So in Ireland you've got Gaelic, in Wales you've got Brythonic, British, Celtic, but both gwyddbwyll and fidgil mean wood sense, tree sense, forest logic, wood wisdom, tree wisdom. You can interpretate it in different ways, but they're basically the same name, just one's Irish and one's Welsh. And that implies that the two cultures on either side of the Irish Sea were sharing ideas. And we can just keep it that simple for the time being. Now, with the Irish law of the Ogham, I can't pronounce it, so I'm not going to try to, but in English, it's called the Scholar's Primer, and it can be dated back to 1390 AD. And in the Scholar's Primer, it describes the alder tree as the vanguard of warrior bands, because their shields were made of alder. Now, that's really interesting, this idea. I mean, you would call it, we'd probably just follow Saxons and say a shield wall is the same idea. So it's the vanguard of a warrior band because of the shields being made of alder. Now, if you don't know what the word vanguard means, I wasn't completely sure. A vanguard is the front line of an army. So the front of the army moving forwards is a row of shields, basically. Now, alder was the wood that was favored for making shields. So a lot of its lore is to do with its use as shields. Now, the reason I think, I mean, there is an idea that the kind of structure of alder wood, I've heard it said that if an axe is smashed into it to try and cut, the axe gets stuck into the wood. The fibers kind of hold the axe and the attacking warrior loses their weapon. I'm not convinced about that. I think it's a probably more mundane reason. And the wonderful thing about alder, unlike any other wood at all, is alder is waterproof. And it's a tree that loves being by the water, but it's waterproof. So, you know, in Holland, clogs, the wooden shoes are made of alder because they're waterproof. And Venice, the town of Venice, its foundations are alder trees. So first they chop loads of alder trees down, lie them down and build Venice on top, because it's a solid thing. It's not going to deteriorate in the water. You can even use older wood for plumbing because it's waterproof. Now, I think that's much more functional for shields because it's damp proof. It's as simple as that. You know, the British Isles, if anyone lives here, knows how wet and damp it is. You know, if you have a shield, you don't want it to get damp and weakened because it's starting to rot. You know, you want a wood that's going to stay dry even on a wet campaign of weeks and weeks of rain. You know, you would know that your older shield was dry. And the other thing is, when it's been seasoned a long time, it is very, very light. It's not heavy to hold, you know. So you don't want a heavy wood like oak for a shield. It'd be too tiring holding it. So you want the lightest wood, and it just so happens that you've got a waterproof wood that's light. So that's perfect for a shield. Now, a curious thing then, so Ireland has this chess-like game and Wales has this chess-like game. And in the Scholar's Primer, it describes the alder tree as being the vanguard of warrior bands, or the front line of the army, because of the shields. Now in Welsh lore, there's a poem credited to Taliesin called in English The Battle of the Trees, and it describes various trees of the forest being magically animated to fight a battle, which brings to mind the game of chess being tree sense, tree logic, or animated trees having a fight because it's a battle of chess. In the Battle of the Trees poem, it says of the alder tree, the alder trees formed the vanguard, the front line. So you've got Ireland saying it's the front line of the army because of the shields, and in the poem, the Welsh poem, it's saying alder tree formed the front line, it formed the vanguard of the Battle of the Trees. So again, both sides of the Irish Sea, both having a magical game of trees, and both acknowledging alder as the front line of the army, whether it's Irish or Welsh, they're both saying the same thing. I get very nerdy and excited about this because it's tantalizing. I'm sure that this game, this obscure game called Gwythgwyl or Fidgel, is going to teach us a lot of tree lore, but we've still got a lot of unraveling to figure out. Now, back to the Irish lore of the Ogham. So there's the Scholar's Primer, which just gives you one sentence, which is what talked about the vanguard of the army. And there's also something called the Briatherogham or the Briatherogham, and it's 3 different word kennings from 3 different, theoretically, 3 different people that gave their simple word kennings of understandings for each letter of the Ogham. Now, the first of these literally says or translates in English as vanguard of warriors. Again, frontline shields. The other one, the next one is interesting, and it's simply milk container. So what's that telling you? It's just, yes, it's waterproof. You can make a milk container. It's not going to contaminate it. It's not going to rot and so on, you know. So it's remembering simplistically that, you know, you can store milk in this wood. It's perfectly fine. It's waterproof. And then the third one, a little bit more abstract, but obvious if you're thinking of a shield. The third one is protection of the heart. Now, the heart is on the left-hand side of the body. We get a heart attack or a stroke, it's your left arm that's going to tingle. You know, most people are right-handed, so your sword's in your right hand, so therefore the shield is in the left hand. You know, so protecting the heart is there with the shield, sword or spear in the right hand. So all of the tree lore, esoteric for the older tree, is suggesting this shield lore more than anything. So looking then, I don't know of any older tree mythology in Ireland. I'm just not aware of it. If it exists, I don't know it yet. But older certainly comes up in Welsh lore and in some very obscure stories. The first of them is in the Mabinogion. It's branch 2, which is usually called Branwen, daughter of Lear, is the common title given to it. And that's the story then of, I would say, the god Bran, and he's the main figurehead, but really it's a family tragedy. He is the king at that moment in time of the British Isles, or Britain. And he is a good king. He's gigantic, he's massive. And he does everything he can to be the best king he can. But it's the whole story is interfered with by a trickster character who's a half-brother of Bran. And he's very much like the Norse god Loki. He does all sorts of horrible, nasty things that causes chaos for everybody. But simplistically, the story tells of a king of Ireland. This is quite interesting then, because talking about cultures on both sides of the Irish Sea, both having the same game of chess and saying the same thing about the older tree. So the story in branch 2 is of the king of Ireland coming to Britain and asking Bran for his sister's hand in marriage. And he's proposing an alliance between Ireland and Britain that makes them both stronger. And it all sounds like a great idea. So Bran agrees that the king of Ireland can marry Branwen, his sister Branwen. And she's clearly a sovereignty goddess. And it's a recurring thing in certainly Brythonic lore and Irish lore. I won't go into that too much, it takes too long. But simplistically, after some turmoil, she does become Queen of Ireland, but she's abused and dishonored, and yeah, it's not nice. And so she's kept prisoner pretty much, but she has a child. So her child is a boy, and his name is Gwern, which is Welsh for alder tree. Now, so this is a curious thing. And in the Ogham, the third tree, the alder, is Fern or Fern. Fern is the Irish name for the alder tree. Gwern is the Welsh name for the alder tree. So you can see how close they are culturally. And even in Old Irish, it's not Fern, it's Wern with a W. So the Old Irish Wern is closer to the Welsh Gwern than Fern. Anyway, they're all variants on a theme. So this sovereignty goddess, or what the royal bloodline of Britain and the royal bloodline of Ireland, the offspring is alder tree, a little boy. But the mother goddess is abused and she's kept prisoner and she's slapped every day by the staff of the king. And she trains a little bird to fly back to Britain to tell her brother how badly she's being treated. And that happens. So then the bigger part of the story then is Bran finding out what trouble his sister is in and summoning all of the armies of Britain to invade Ireland and rescue her, basically. And there's much more to it than that, and there's lots of details inside, including this mysterious cauldron of rebirth, which you can put a dead soldier in and they come back out of it alive, but they can't talk. And in the story, they actually referred to it as the cauldron of rebirth. there's too much to say about that, and it's complicated. It's to do with otherworld things and giants, and Bran himself is a giant, and the cauldron originally belongs to giants. Anyway, Bran and his army cross the Irish Sea. Bran is so big he can wade through it. You know, he's huge. And the Irish soldiers see what they think is a forest crossing the water towards them. And that's an interesting little detail, because that's like an animated forest again. It's a motif that comes up. And they run to their king, and he doesn't know what this forest is crossing the water. And like he said, the only person who would know would be Branwen. So they ask Branwen, what's this forest crossing the water? And she explains it's the masts of all of the ships coming to rescue her, you know. And there's also a big ridge and two big lakes that seem to be hovering above the forest, and it's Bran's nose and his two eyes. So that's how big he is, you know. Anyway, quite tragically, the British forces managed to defeat Ireland, but it's at a heavy cost. And Branwen's son, Alder is thrown into the fire and killed. It is a horrible, tragic story. And they managed to defeat the Irish forces and return to Britain. But Bran had summoned all of the armies of Britain, and only 7 people survived. That's how catastrophic the whole thing was. And the story says that when Branwen got back to Wales, she was devastated with all of the loss of life and the loss of her own son, that she died of a heartache, and her grave is on the Welsh coastline. And Bran himself was poisoned by a spear, and he knows he's about to die. And with his 7 survivors, he says, look, you've got to cut off my head and bury it at the Tower of where the current Tower of London is, in London. And there's a whole story then of them carrying his head to London to be buried at the White Hill to protect the land from invaders. And the story is very strange, because you've already been into very surreal landscape with the whole Irish island invasion affair, but even with just getting Bran's decapitated head to London, they spend 7 years at Harlech listening to the song of the birds of Rhiannon. Now that's a poetic metaphor for spending 7 years in the Summerland, because the birds of Rhiannon are the summer stars. And then after that, they spent another 80 years near the south coast of Wales, almost like the kind of Celtic fairy lore where time is different. You know, you might be in the other world for a day and you come back and 100 years have passed by, sort of thing, you know. So they spend this time outside of time. And you could say that for them, they were only there a brief while, but 80 years have passed by, sort of thing, on their way to London. So there's all these kind of otherworld liminal things to get Bran's head buried. A curious thing in that, when Branwen's son, and he's only a little boy, he's not a man, is thrown into the fire, she's there. It all happens in like a feasting hall. And of course, she's devastated and she wants to grab him, but it's too late. And she would throw herself into the fire too. And Bran grabs her and stops her from throwing herself into the fire. And it actually says that he shielded her, but from the fire with his shield. So again, it was this emphasis of a shield that Bran had. Curious. So that's the rather macabre story of Branch 2, but it has a few elements. It has the shielding, it has the Alder tree, and it has this cauldron of rebirth. Now, there's the poem called The Battle of Trees, which was credited to Taliesin, and in that poem, it actually describes the Alder trees as the vanguard of the army. But there's another little bit in the poem that actually mentions Bran. So this is separate to the story in the Mabinogion. This is a bit of poetry on the side, and it tells about the god Gwydion, who's a god of trees and tree magic. And during the Battle of the Trees, you win by identifying the opponent you're fighting. And he finally wins by identifying the god Bran. And he identifies him by the older branches on his shield. Again, it's the shield, it's the older branches, but that allows Gwydion to identify Bran. So what's going on there? On the one hand, you could say that the older tree is Bran's motif, but equally in the Mabinogion, it's the name of his nephew. So it's some sort of family symbol or motif or heraldry or whatnot. Now, we touched on this before I started recording. There's another Welsh poem credited to Taliesin, but it's about King Arthur. And this poem is called The Spoils of Annwn, or The Spoiling of Annwn. And it's very, very similar to Branch 2, because in Branch 2, you've got Bran going to the west to get this magic cauldron and only 7 survivors. And in The Spoiling of Annwn, King Arthur goes into the other world, Annwn, and there's a magic cauldron and a strange magical sword, and there are only 7 survivors. It's the same story almost, but they're 2 different characters, Bran and Arthur. And there's also later lore of Arthur removing Bran's head from the White Hill, Tower of London, almost arrogantly saying he's going to defend the land, nobody else. So he removes Bran's head, and that's thought to be a big catastrophe as well, you know. But the same motifs are there of this cauldron and 7 survivors. Now, with those glimpses, then, the star lore in the Ogham Grove of the older tree is that it governs, and there's a diagram which I'll put on the Facebook page later, but older governs 15 degrees Aquarius to 3 degrees Pisces. Now, directly opposite that, or metaphorically across the river or across the sea from that, is the opposite zodiac or law. So directly opposite Aquarius is Leo, and Alder goes from Aquarius into Pisces. So the mirror of that, the mirror opposite, if you like, is Leo going into Virgo. Now, there's some very, very significant star law with that Leo-Virgo cusp, which is directly opposite Alder. Now, it's this, the cusp between Leo and Virgo. On the Leo side, there's the secondary constellation that's called Crater, the wine mixing cup. And there's plenty of evidence to show that this was the cauldron from a Celtic perspective, Ceridwen's cauldron, cauldron of rebirth. It ticks the boxes of many different stories, but it's there in the heavens directly opposite the older tree. There's this celestial cauldron. And on the Virgo side of the cusp, there's a constellation of the crow, Corvus. So you have this cauldron or chalice or cup and this crow or raven. And in the Ceridwen story, a black hen. It's the same cauldron and blackbird, if you like, you know, it's a recurring motif. So that's there, you know, so like when the sun is in the older tree, the full moon is directly opposite. So the full moon is in the cauldron and the raven, if you like, in the star lore. So that's fascinating. You know, you've got the older cauldron position 3. It's the second herald of Imbolc. And Imbolc, of course, is Bridie, Brigid. And as Brigantia in northern Britain, her main symbols are a spear and a shield, you know, so she's there with a shield too. So Alder almost in its Imbolc position as Bridie's shield, a very protective thing, protecting the British Isles, Bridie's Isles, you know, that are fascinating. I'm beginning to see Alder as Bridie's shield following Imbolc, you know, and then directly opposite then is all of the star lore of the cauldron and the crow, raven, which seems to be echoed in the Welsh stories. Now, the crossing of the river Milky Way or whatever to the opposite side of the zodiac wheel. There's a diagram, and I've got no solutions with that. I'm just still sharing ideas. Make of it what you will. So that's that. I'll stop there, and then we'll have a conversation about it, and we'll do a bit of meditating. Okay, I'll stop the recording.